I had been wandering all summer in a vast forest without roads or houses. I followed the paths of deer and raccoons, crossing desolate hillsides and quiet valleys. For a rainy week I paced back and forth through a lonely meadow, until the ground was tread into mud. One evening I walked over a cliff, and tumbled through branches and shrubs until I crashed into a stony crevice. I laid still on the rocks for several days. Then I got to my feet and moved on. I hadn't encountered another person the entire time. Then, one moonless autumn night, I was crossing a grassy plain when I saw a little girl standing alone in the distance, her shoulders barely clearing the tops of the tall grass. She must have heard me as I approached. She turned and walked my way, stopping when she had crossed my path. We stood facing each other for several minutes. Then I continued on my way. The girl followed. That night we passed some shacks and fences, and at dawn we came to a road and started following it. A car passed. Its passengers leaned out the windows and shouting at us. It stopped up ahead and waited as we approached. When we were almost beside the car, it abruptly took off with the tires squealing. We realized that it would be dangerous for us to be seen, so we decided to conceal ourselves. After that, cars would drive past without noticing us, but I had to pull the girl over to the curb when I heard them coming so she wouldn't be hit. We walked day and night on country roads, passing many farms and houses without creating commotion. Dogs would follow us and bark, but nobody paid attention. One night we encountered a stray collie which wouldn't leave us alone. The girl held it down and I smashed its head with a rock. We often saw people walking on the road, mostly in daylight but sometimes at night. Since we were hidden they usually took no notice of us, but sometimes in the twilight, a person walking alone would suddenly react and flee in the opposite direction. One lonely night, we encountered a teenager walking on the road. My clothes were in shreds, and I realized that he was my size. When he came closer we revealed ourselves. He was terrified and wanted to get away, but we wouldn't let them. "Come into the woods with us," I said. He didn't want to go, but he had no choice. The girl led the way, and I followed behind the teenager. We pressed through the trees and bushes until we came to a secluded clearing illuminated only by moonlight. "Give me your shoes," I said to him. He refused, but then he gave in and removed one shoe and then the other. I asked for his jacket, his belt, his shirt and pants, and he gave them to me, trembling and whining. The girl couldn't wait any longer, she jumped on his back and brought him down, screaming, while I carefully changed into his clothes. Then I joined her. When we were finished, we dragged his remains over to a gap under a fallen tree and stuffed him in. We piled up rocks to cover him, and went back to the road. In the coming days and nights we traversed several small towns, walking past barber shops, grocery marts, police stations and quiet neighborhoods. We studied our sunlit reflections in a storefront window. Our hair was mussed and our clothes were grimy, but our complexions were smooth and rosy. It was only our eyes that gave us away. One afternoon we were on the highway and passed a sign that said Atticus, 5 miles. The girl stopped a few yards after the sign. She was sensing something I could not. She stood listening a few minutes, then she took me by the hand and led me off the road and up a steep grassy hill. At the top we crawled under a barbed wire fence and walked through a field where cows were grazing. After a half-mile hike we ventured into the woods. We came out onto a hillside with a view of the nearby town, which I assumed was Atticus. The girl led me out to the middle of the field, and we stood in the tall grass and waited. The quiet scene was interrupted by a rustling sound behind me. A teenaged boy emerged from the woods and approached us. He was followed by a teenaged girl and a younger boy. The newcomers walked over and stood beside us. We all stared down at the town as the sun began to set. That night, the 5 of us approached a roadhouse with a bright neon sign and honky-tonk music playing inside. A crowd of customers mingled out front, and many were sitting in their cars in the parking lot. We crossed the street to the parking lot and walked over to one of the occupied cars. "Can you give us a ride?" I asked. The driver looked us over. "Fucking shit!" he cried. He started up his car and abruptly pulled out. We had to step back to avoid getting hit. We turned our attention to another car. Its driver quickly rolled up the windows and laid on the horn. Beside it, a pickup truck took up the chorus. We retreated over to the front of the tavern, where we attracted the attention of the crowd. "What are you kids up to?" demanded a burly man in a red flannel shirt. "We're just trying to get home," I said. He stalked over and got a good look at us. "Jesus Christ!" he cried. He backed away and stumbled on the concrete. I approached him. "Can you give us a ride?" I asked. He scrambled to his feet and ran into the tavern, screaming. Laughter broke out, but some in the crowd were eyeing us warily. We crossed the street and waited in the dark. Moments later, the man in the red flannel shirt emerged with a gang of his friends. "It looks like they're gone," he said. "Come on, Tony, why are you so spooked by a bunch of little kids?" "It's their eyes, man, there's no whites in them. It's like those goddamn paintings of the kids with the big eyes." His friends all laughed and took him back inside. We watched for hours from across the street. Finally, when the roadhouse was about to close, Tony and his friends emerged. He looked around nervously, then headed over to a blue pickup and got in. The truck took a left out of the parking lot and barreled down the road. We headed in the same direction. After a few miles we came upon an isolated house set far back from the road. The lights were all out, but we could hear a radio, and someone inside was moving about. We climbed the stairs to the porch. I knocked on the door and a middle-aged woman answered. "May we come in, ma'am?" I asked. "Goodness, what time is it? There's a man out here scaring us. Can we come in while you call the police?" "Of course," she said, and held open the door. We stepped into her living room, which was all dark. "How many of you are there?" she asked. "There are 5 of us, ma'am, all children. May I turn on a light?" "Be my guest," she said. I switched on a lamp. Examining her in the light, I realized at once that the woman was blind, and could not be useful to us. I was deciding whether to stay or go when she spoke. "Where did you see this man?" she asked. "I'll call the police." "I'd rather you didn't, ma'am. Can we stay here just until it's light out?" "Certainly. My name is Mrs. Chapman, by the way." She stood there without speaking for a few moments. I realized that she was waiting for a response from me. "My name is Arthur. This is Jonathan, Ruth, Eric, and Susan," I said, inventing names for the 5 of us. "Your friends don't say much, do they?" said Mrs. Chapman. "They can't speak, ma'am." "Oh really? That's too bad." "Mrs. Chapman, do you have any child-sized clothing? Our outfits are very worn out." "I think I do, actually. My children are grown, but I saved some hand-me-downs. Let me check. Come along now." She moved confidently through the house, touching a wall or piece of furniture now and then to guide her way. We followed her to an upstairs bedroom and she opened a drawer. "You're welcome to any of these," she said. I handed out clothes to the others, and they began changing into them. Suddenly Mrs. Chapman touched my shoulder, and then drew her hand back. "I guess you're real, after all," she said, and smiled. "For a minute I actually thought you were a hallucination. You're all so quiet. It's almost as if..." She became suddenly serious. "As if you're not breathing." She shrank back from us. Behind her was a bathroom, and with surprising speed she slipped through the door and slammed it behind her. I grasped the doorknob just as she snapped the bolt in place. "Go away!" she screamed. I held my station next to the door while the others finished changing. "Thank you for the clothes, Mrs. Chapman," I said. I left the bedroom and the others followed me. We gathered in the living room for a moment before exiting through the front door. It was almost dawn. We wandered the neighborhoods of Atticus for most of the day until we found the blue pickup truck. Then we waited until sundown, standing across the street from the shabby bungalow where it was parked. With darkness fully upon us, we crossed the street, walked up to the enclosed front porch of the bungalow and knocked on the door. A woman in her 20s came to the door. "Is Tony here?" I asked. She called into the house, "Tony, there's some kids to see you." She opened the screen door and let us in. She stumbled backwards when she'd gotten a better look at us. "Tony!" she screamed. A puzzled reply came from within the house. The boys and I went inside. The girls stayed on the porch to attend to the young woman. I found Tony in the kitchen. He screamed when he saw me, and stood up so fast he knocked the kitchen table over. Howling a stream of profanities, the big man rummaged about the kitchen counter until he got hold of a large chopping knife. He threw it at me. It hit my chest by the handle and fell to the floor. With a wave of my hand I made Tony quiet down. "Come along," I said, "let's take a walk in the woods." Tony didn't want to go, but he had no choice. Whimpering, he left the kitchen with us. On the porch, the girls were overseeing the young woman. They heard her turning around in circles, her head rolling from side to side like she was in a deep sleep. We left her behind as we took Tony outside. We walked him to the end of the road and down a path into the woods. The hike was difficult for Tony because he was barefoot, but I insisted that he keep going. After half a mile the path twisted down into a dark and muddy ravine overgrowth with reeds. Up ahead loomed the structure of a bridge for a 4-lane highway. We headed for it. The bridge had massive support columns set into a concrete base. We stepped up onto the concrete and stood in the shadows, listening to the traffic rushing by 50 feet above us. I pointed to the smooth concrete floor. "Lie down here, Tony." The big man pleaded with us to let him go, but eventually he got down and lay on his back on the concrete. The small girl climbed on Tony's chest and bent over him. He screamed as she took his head in her hands and forcing him to look into her eyes. She began extracting his car. I watched the woods around us in case the flashes of blue light attracted unwanted attention. His screams grew weaker and weaker, and then the girl got up. The others took their turns. Finally it was my turn. I took the rest of him. The boys and I dragged his shriveled remains over to the juncture between ground and the underside of the bridge. Pulling back some rocks, we uncovered a hollow cavity large enough for a man. We stuffed him in and pushed the rocks back in place. When we climbed down, the girls were gone. They had probably gone back for the young woman at Tony's house. The boys paced back and forth for a few minutes. Then they too headed back to Atticus. I stood in the shadows under the bridge for some time. A deer emerged from the bushes and strutted past the bridge, eyeing me cautiously. I stepped down from the concrete and crossed under the bridge. I picked up a trail that traced the contour of the gully and led deep into the dark wilderness, where the sounds of traffic didn't penetrate. I did not see the others again.